There's never been a drink that has caused so much controversy, so much conflict, and so much commerce as tea in the 18th century. This drink is still incredibly important today. We don't think about it that much, but tea is the #2 beverage in the world after water. Today in the United States, we feel like we're very coffee-centric, but still in the United States, tea is very, very popular. Up to 50% of people drink tea very often, and 85% of people drink it at least occasionally. The history of tea is well over 1,000 years old, possibly 2,000 years ago in China when they started developing and really processing teas. But the history of tea in Europe, Western Europe and North America is much shorter. Tea doesn't get introduced into Europe until 1606 by the Dutch. And it really has a very slow start to it. It really isn't until like the 1660s and the 1670s when tea starts to become very popular. The East India Company in London doesn't start bringing in tea until, again, 1666 or a little bit later than that, even though they had a license to do it much earlier. But tea in this time period is extremely profitable. It is very expensive in the 17th century, and so it is a lucrative trade. They really want to make it very, very popular so that they can make a lot of money off of it. And tea it's actually pretty easy to transport. It can last a long time. They would have like a 3-year supply of tea, so it doesn't go bad terribly quickly. And it's fairly light. It's a little bulky, but it's very light. So in the tea ship, if you got a ship that's all full of tea, you need ballast to make it upright. So what do? You fill the lower part of the ship up with all the goods it takes to use tea. That's another great thing about tea in the time period. It had a lot of paraphernalia that went with it. Teacups and teapots, so that they would be able to sell not just tea, but all this wonderful expensive equipment that is imported also. So what is tea? Tea is a simple leaf from a particular kind of tree, or really they're kind of shrunk down to a shrub these days. In the time period, they were probably, smaller little trees. And you would pick the leaves off at a very particular time, depending on the tea you were trying to develop. Very young, tender leaves at some point. You might let them age a little bit for other types of tea, probably less expensive kinds of tea. And there was a lot of different processing. The leaves have to be withered, so you have to kind of let them dry out and get soft. That might happen maybe for just a couple of hours or possibly a couple of days, depending on the type of tea. You would also cause them to be crushed or slightly ripped to get them to oxidize. So that's where the black teas come from, or possibly the oolongs. So something's going on, they're sort of fermenting is another way you can kind of think of it. That really starts to develop different kinds of chemicals in the tea. It changes its chemical composition, and it certainly changes its flavor. Green teas are different. You don't want that to happen, and if they start to ferment too much, you would actually sort of cook them in metal pans in the time period. They would be roasted in that way so that this fermentation process would stop, and then you would dry those a little bit further, and they were sort of ready to be packed up at that point. So depending on all these different processes, you would get completely different flavors and have teas that were very expensive or fairly inexpensive. But none of that is really going on in Europe. All these teas are coming fully ready to be used in the ships. Another great thing about teas in the time period and teas today is there are a lot of different varieties of tea. Now, the most popular in the time period, they would have called bohea tea. And this tea is a simple black tea. It is fermented, has this great, wonderful, robust smell to it and great flavors. That's the most popular and probably fairly inexpensive that was coming out of China in the time period. But they also had green teas and oolong teas. They had Hai-song teas that were green teas. One of the other popular styles of tea in the 18th century was the gunpowder tea. This is a green tea where the leaves are all curled up and it looks like little granules. It looks like gunpowder from the time period. I don't want to leave out the concepts of herbal teas in the time period, infusions, and tea substitutes. Yes, those were definitely there and they had been used in Europe much earlier than true tea comes in from China, but it's not used as a daily beverage in the same kind of way. They were really thought of medicinally. Now, in fact, when regular tea does come in the early 17th century, it is many times thought of very, very medicinally. It is so expensive that it is used as a medicine, and one of the big outlets for tea are apothecaries. So you might go to someplace to buy tea, you might go to the coffee house, but if you want regular green tea, you'll go to the apothecary because it was kind of classified in that medicinal way, at least in the 17th century. We also have a North American version of tea. It's called yaupon. And yaupon is a type of a holly bush that has caffeine in it. It's one of the very few plants in North America that has caffeine. And this was popular in the 18th century as a tea substitute. It gets so popular in the 19th century that the English attack it. They give it a name that makes it sound bad in Latin, something having to do with vomit. So they really were trying to suppress the idea. You don't want substitute tea from America. You want to get this wonderful tea that we're importing from China. Now, what about tea blending? So many teas that we have today are blended teas or flavored teas. That's really what we enjoy so much. That is a development that's happening in the early 18th century. The famous name of Twinings is one of those pioneers of the concept of blending teas. He would have his tea house open and he would have giant crates of tea, open them all up, even have those very rich customers come in and do special blends together with them. And because each kind of chest of tea is a little bit different, you could blend different ones together to have a much smoother flavor. You might blend black teas and green teas together. Later on in the 19th century and possibly in the later 18th century, ladies would get together and do their own sort of blending on the spot as they were doing their tea party. Most of the tea products that come along, the teapots, the teacups that come in from China, they were extremely popular. And the makers of these similar products in Europe wanted to do exactly the same thing, but they could not meet the same technological developments that China had in the time period. It was a struggle for the French potters, the Dutch potters, and the English potters to come up with anything like the quality of the items that were coming in from China. So this is driving technology. Tea itself and the products like it are driving technology. And it isn't until the late 17th century and the middle of the 18th century that wonderful porcelain products are finally being made by the Europeans, driven by the Chinese products that are coming in. And they're decorated in very, very similar ways. Before porcelain is developed, well, the Europeans did their best. They were making simple imitations of the beautiful Chinese ware that's coming in from the time period. They would have very crude means to do these reproductions, very simplistic designs, and very easy to damage products. I mentioned the idea of conflict, and there is a lot of conflict that goes on with tea in the 17th century and in the 18th century because it was so lucrative. It caused conflict with the trading companies and the countries that might trade with it. The Dutch, the French, the English, they all want a piece of this action. And it's the English that sort of win out in that category. So how does tea get to England and how does it get to North America? This is a fascinating story about the East India Company. It is the biggest company in the time period. It is huge. It's hard to imagine how big this company was. It had its own army, it had its own navy, basically, hundreds of ships. They're going all the way around Africa and getting to China to load up with these Chinese goods, and specifically this highly profitable product of tea. It's packed in wooden chests, sometimes lead-lined, and they fill up those ships along with the paraphernalia underneath and ship it back to England. This is a long trip. It takes months and months. It might take a half a year to get all the way back to England. But even though this sounds like a very, very expensive trip, they might make 10-fold or 50-fold on their money because the tea is so inexpensive compared to what it's going to sell for in England. And early on, one of the trade goods that they took was sage. The herb sage was trading as much as 4-to-1 to tea. So you could get a lot of tea for a small quantity of sage. Early on, those traders knew to bring back tea, even if it was in smaller quantities, because it was so amazingly profitable. So if tea is that expensive, is it just for the rich? In our time period, going from the 17th century into the 18th century, tea goes from the drink of the extremely rich to the drink of everybody. So by the time we get to the end of the 18th century, the poorest of the poor can afford tea, and everyone is drinking it. It is sort of a universal thing by the end of the 18th century. Now, one of the reasons that is true is because of a taxation difference. Tea wasn't just expensive because, you could sell it for a lot, but it was also taxed fairly heavily in Great Britain in the 17th century and in the 18th century. So it isn't until 1784 when Richard Twining convinces the government that they could actually make more money by lowering the taxes on the tea. And the tea would become much more popular, and then they would actually get more taxes. So there's a particular law that goes in 1784 that changes the tables on tea almost upside down to make it so popular for everyone. Before that time, tea was so expensive and taxed so highly that there was a lot of fakery or illegal activity going on around tea. Tea was being smuggled. It might be smuggled in by the French, who really weren't that interested in tea. They were much more interested in coffee, but they didn't mind selling it to people. And you would have people doing adulterations of tea, or selling old tea that you've used once or twice or 3 times as new tea. So people would take tea leaves that were already used, they dried them out, they would dye them, maybe put some chemicals on them to make them taste a little bit more, and then resell it as new tea. There was a lot of tea theft going on, so your tea caddy would have a lock on it. It was that expensive. So tea's causing conflict with the commerce, but it's also causing conflict because of this taxation issue. So tea is being taxed in England, but it's also being taxed again when it comes to the New World. All the tea that's coming into North America that's not smuggled is coming in from England on purpose. They want to be the conduit by which all things come to North America because it's their colonies. So there's the Stamp Act. In 1765, Great Britain comes up with the Stamp Act that helps to fund the war that just got over, which is the French Indian War. So in 1765, they tax a lot of different things like playing cards and paper, and tea is one of those things that gets taxed. There is upheaval in the colonies. And so they finally repeal some of the Stamp Act. They take away those taxes, but they don't take away the tax on tea. Now, tea is, again, very lucrative and very popular, and it's an easy thing to tax. There's a lot of money in it. Tea is coming into Boston during the 1770s, and at one point, the Bostonites have had enough of this taxation. The only way they can figure out how to deal with this is to reject the concept of bringing tea in at all. The ships come in with tea, and they won't let them leave with the tea, and they won't let them unload the tea. December 16th, 1773, they decide The best way to deal with this is to throw the tea overboard into the harbor to ruin that tea. They don't allow it to be unloaded. They don't allow it to go back. And this will cause the vendors, the people who are actually trying to sell that tea, of true economic problems, and that will put pressure on the government. It certainly does. It's really one of those first gunshots of the American Revolution when this happens. This causes the British to react in a lot of negative ways, and that really causes the revolution, the American Revolution, to come to the forefront. During the American Revolution, tea was very political. The idea that you're drinking tea puts you on the wrong side of the fence. So there are different places and different times when tea isn't available. It might even be against the law or very, very frowned upon, and coffee becomes more popular. But there are also people in North America, even during the Revolution, that need their tea so much that they're willing to smuggle it in or to pay the taxes. Tea was very revolutionary in the 17th and 18th century. It is changing the world. It is changing where the ships are going, what they're carrying, where the commerce is happening. There's so much to think about. It's changing the way people eat and the way people drink. It is also causing great amounts of conflict. Conflict internally, conflict with politics. So, tea is much more important than anybody would ever think. So it's no wonder that tea is the catalyst that kicks off the American Revolution.